Minnesota Governor Tim Walz finally succumbs to the gravity of his state's massive welfare scandal and says he will not run for a third term. Meanwhile, the Trump administration ramps up on the state, declaring it is unleashing a relentless assault to dismantle the massive fraud empires of Minnesota. What's all this mean for the state, for federal welfare programs, and for our upcoming elections?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel. And for the answers to those questions, we are fortunate to have with us this week a Minnesota native and expert, former Minnesota governor and presidential candidate, Tim Pawlenty. Governor, first of all, Happy New Year. And wow, it's a wild time in the North Star State right now. How is everyone bearing up there?
Well, Happy New Year to you, Kim, and to all of your listeners. And in our state, people are mad. I mean, there's a lot of fraud. People work hard in Minnesota. They pay a lot of taxes. And when it gets stolen, they're understandably very frustrated and very mad.
Yeah, and just a little reprise for anyone, although it might be hard to believe, who hasn't heard about this. Attention is on a significant number of individuals who are found to have defrauded numerous welfare programs in Minnesota. The first indictments actually came out when Biden was still president, but to date, DOJ has charged 98 individuals, 85 of whom are of Somali descent, 64 of whom have already been convicted. The schemes range from setting up sham businesses to falsely claim to have provided meals to children, paying kickbacks to parents to enroll kids without autism in autism treatment, billing Medicaid for phony housing services. Prosecutions have shown that these scammers have used their proceeds on luxury cars and vacations. It's a really ugly story, Governor. And so before we dive in, especially because I think there's so many angles to this, so many ways you can look at this, and people are looking at it in different ways. I wanted to just ask you, from your 30,000 foot appraisal, like what actually is the story here? What went wrong? Who should we be pointing a finger at? What should we be pointing a finger at?
Well, trying my best just to set aside the spin and the political BS, Kim, here's what I know to be pretty good facts. The legislative auditor, which is a nonpartisan and well-respected auditing organization within Minnesota for years, has been sending signals and warnings about the lack of financial controls in Minnesota and the potential for fraud. And there's a culture inside of Minnesota state government that is pretty rotten when it comes to taking these kinds of allegations or concerns seriously. And to give you just two quick examples, one is in 2018, when there was an earlier version of a fraud investigation, just like the ones you're hearing about now, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension had investigators looking into it for criminal charges. And they were frustrated and they discontinued or didn't bring charges in one or more cases because the investigators said the state bureaucrats wouldn't cooperate with them and give them data and information they needed to prove their case. And in the investigators' summary of what happened, they said the state employees said that they didn't want to, quote unquote, be a tool of law enforcement or enable law enforcement. Can you imagine the mindset, the culture within a bureaucracy where you have employees being able to stare down criminal investigators and nobody does anything to those employees, hold them accountable, fire them? And then the list goes on and on. I won't even give you the second example in the interest of time, but there are lots of those kinds of examples. And it's also pretty clear that the Walz administration just looked the other way, didn't take seriously, or ducked for a variety of reasons when these concerns were raised over the years.
The bureaucracy you're talking about, do you think that's ideological? Is it job security? Is it, what is it? I mean, is it just a belief that if they were to help law enforcement, that some of these programs might get shut down and they wouldn't have, the positions they do? What do you think drives that kind of mentality you just mentioned?
Well, it's hard to know exactly the mindset of those employees because we're not them, but I think the theories that you just listed could all apply. And, let's face it, a lot of people who go into government, particularly in sort of early entry level or mid-level government jobs, are sometimes kind of activists. And you can imagine that they might have an anti-law enforcement bias or don't want to hurt, quote unquote, social programs, don't want to, be viewed as racist if their investigation involves people who are minority or diverse, and the list goes on. So, but whichever answer from the menu you just provided, there's not a good selection from that menu.
I want to broaden this out just a little bit, because you talked about how there's been a lot of warning signals from this auditor about how something needed to be done. But I want to ask you about the broader state of the welfare system, and Minnesota's in particular. And, one of my views here is that I think that this has kind of provided some proof that we've really got like a bigger fundamental problem with our welfare system, in that, this was designed, it was originally meant to be a system that provided temporary assistance in times of dire need. And Americans are all about doing that. We are a generous people. But it has now become so large, so huge. It's a transfer system riddled with fraud. And you might disagree with this, but Minnesota seems to be a kind of particular example of this, in that it's actually bragged about its sort of Scandinavian style generous welfare program. There's a lot of things there that a lot of states don't have. We could walk through them all, but isn't maybe the problem that we have too much of this in general, that we need to rethink the broader federal and state welfare programs, and try to get them back more to what they were designed originally to be?
Right. In general, absolutely, Kim, and especially true in Minnesota. And I'll give you a couple of quick points. One is, we have to stop measuring our commitment to helping people in need by how much money we spend, and start measuring that commitment to the success that we have in the outcomes of improving their lives. And education is a great example of that. The correlation between money in and results out is something that's been long forgotten, unfortunately, but it's one of many examples. Two is, it's so bad in Minnesota that when the U.S. attorney held his most recent press conference, he used the term and said that Minnesota is now a place where people go for fraud tourism. And he charged and cited a couple people from Philadelphia who said they came to Minnesota because they had heard the systems are so lax that it was easy money. They had heard it was easy money to come to Minnesota. And again, the stories go on and the charges go on. But the point is, you are exactly right. The thing is, all of government is too big. The money is spent too much. There's no accountability, little accountability. We're focused on inputs instead of outcomes. And we have to hold the government responsible and accountable, and nobody's really doing it. I would say President Trump and his team are an exception in many respects.
Well, when you talk about government, because I think this is something else people have a little bit of trouble getting their head around. We've now talked about the Trump administration coming in to do something, DOJ, prosecutors, but you talked about Minnesota's auditor that's at the state level. I mean, a lot of these programs are administered at a joint state federal cooperative element. And so one of the questions I have, and I'd love to hear your thoughts because you've done this as governor. I mean, whose job is it exactly to catch this fraud? Whose job is it then to fix it and make sure that it doesn't happen anymore?
Everybody in the chain of events. And Kim, you know, but every fraud story has a common element. And the common element is people fail to check. And whether that's in the private sector or in the public sector, almost every fraud case involves somebody conducting a fraud and the other side doesn't check. And you can't check everything every day, everywhere, but you got to check enough to be able to detect fraud as a pattern. And with the advance of AI and technology, you should be able to check a lot of things, maybe many things, maybe most things. But it's pretty clear here, nobody checked. And one relevant example, when they did the recent federal legislation to change Medicaid, the Republicans proposed and passed into law that you had to check eligibility for Medicaid, not once a year, but now twice a year. And the Democrats went insane over that. And again, they're pushing back against checking. And so if you don't want to check, you're going to get fraud.
Yeah, and that's something that actually does frustrate me. You mentioned, the private sector and the public sector, although in the private sector, when these frauds come out, people lose their jobs for having failed to check.
Right.
And
that's right.
This is a particular problem we have with accountability in government.
And by the way, in Minnesota, to my knowledge, nobody, think about this, nobody, after years and years of fraud, maybe going over $9 billion, maybe the largest the theft of public funds in American history, nobody got fired.
Yeah, not one. And, I mean, I guess, yay, Tim Walz isn't going to run for a third term, but there might have been a day in politics where you actually resigned in the face of this. Was he right to decide not to run for a third term?
Absolutely. I think it was a wise decision for him. There's just an avalanche of bad news. It's not going to end easily or quickly. More is coming in terms of federal agency investigations, more audits at the federal level, more criminal charges, more reviews at the state level. So there was just no way for him to crawl out from underneath this. And so I think he made a good decision to not run for a third term. And he shouldn't have been running for a third term to begin with, in my view.
Well, there's that. I want to bring up a different aspect of this because it's another thing that's getting a lot of attention. We've been talking about the fraud element, but this is the immigration question. The administration is sending more than 2,000 personnel from the Department of Homeland Security to Minneapolis and surrounding areas. They are carrying out immigration arrests. In an email over the weekend, it announced that it arrested 1,000 criminal illegal aliens. What's not clear to me is if that criminal term refers to actions related anyway to this fraud or just because they happen to be in the country without the right papers. But talk a little bit about Minnesota's Somali community. It's been at the epicenter of this. And I wonder how you explain this. Is this something that could have happened in any immigration population that was there, this fraud, or is this something more specific to this particular immigrant community in Minnesota? Because that's just been a big debate going on out there.
Well, what we know for sure is Minnesota has an unusual or abnormal amount of refugees resettlements for its size. And that's in large part because of course, the federal government decides the number of refugees that come into the country, but there are nonprofit agencies at the local level in Minnesota and across the country whose business model is to resettle and get compensated for settling refugees. And so Minnesota has a unusually robust amount of that. So that's just a piece of background or history. And as to these charges, we don't want to stigmatize a particular group because of their ethnic or religious backgrounds, but we also don't want to excuse or look the other way or discount charges against somebody because they're in such a group. And here you have almost all of the people charged so far, Somalis. And why they in particular were engaged in this behavior, and maybe we'll find out in the future others were too. There's a few that weren't Somalis that have been charged so far. But I don't have a good insight as to why the Somalis in particular seem to be the ones at the root cause of this most recent scandal.
Do you think this country has, or Minnesota in particular, because this is a topic that has certainly come up with relation to this scandal. So questions about assimilation. I'm of the breed of conservative who likes to invite immigrants to our country. I think, my family was certainly an immigrant family. Almost all of our families are immigrant families, unless you were Native American here. And they built this country, but we have always been unique. Obviously the melting pot, the idea is that people shed to a certain extent their old affiliations and become part of the American dream. And that's been an aspect of discussion here with this Somali community, talking about Minneapolis, little Mogadishu, whether or not it's somewhat apart. You were a governor. What does a state need to do? What does we as a country need to do to be more, to be encouraging more or requiring more assimilation in this nation?
Sure. And again, stepping back one step, illegal immigration and immigration more broadly was out of control. And
yes,
so
absolutely.
Absolutely. And so, obviously President Trump has demonstrated you can control the border if you want to. And for decades, more than decades, both parties were negligent or worse in trying to deal with immigration and illegal immigration. Just to give you a magnitude of the impact, the New York Times, not exactly a conservative publication, estimated that 10 million illegal immigrants came to the United States in the 4 years of the Biden administration.
Wow.
So 10 million is about 3% of our population. And then they say, well, we have a 7 million unit housing shortage in America. Well, if you bring in 10 million people, you're going to have millions of units of housing shortage. But it's too many, too fast, and it's got to be legal. It has to be orderly, has to be reasonable in number, and we have to make sure that the people coming in are vetted, including, do you share our consensus common values? For example, do you support the rule of our law, not some version that you have? Do you support civil rights, including how you treat women? We don't allow in this country or tolerate in this country, abuse of women like you see in some of these other countries. Do you have a pathway and a desire to sort of actually get educated and work?
Yes, right.
Do you like America? Do you want to be American as we have defined it over these 250 years? And the list goes on. And I think our vetting process in this regard just sucks.
I think that's right. And then I think this goes back, my own view is this goes back to an overly generous welfare system, which at times can allow communities to exist somewhat apart, right? Other than receiving the checks, they don't necessarily have to interact by having a job or, being engaged in the other aspects of American.
And if I could just also emphasize, Kim, it has to be in reasonable volume. If
Yes.
we take in, or Europe takes in all the people from all the distressed countries in the world, or as many as want to come, it's unmanageable, it's unreasonable, it's unaffordable. And so it has to be legal, it has to be orderly, but it also has to be in reasonable increments and properly vetted.
Yeah, I think that's just an excellent, excellent point. This country has a great track record, as we have noted, over hundreds of years of assimilating people, but under a bit more of an orderly, idea. I want to go back to the politics of this. You talked about Tim Walz a little bit, and I agree with you. It was a wise decision not to take a third term. One other person you had talked about accountability, Keith Ellison, the state attorney general. Should he be dropping out of his race as well, too?
Well, there are two other people, or lots of other people who are going to have to explain what their role was in all of this. Of course, if you're the attorney general of a state, you're the chief law enforcement officer for that state. And Chief Attorney General Ellison is going to have to explain why what he knew, when he knew it, what he did or didn't do. And there's some indication that perhaps he was looking the other way, and including some tape that's circulating where there's a taped conversation with some advocates for the Somali community talking about, requesting, I guess, that he would go light or, push back on claims of fraud in favor of the Somali community. And that's an interesting tape to listen to if your viewers haven't, or listeners haven't. And then the Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, your listeners wouldn't necessarily know who she is, but she's running for U.S. Senate, maybe the leading candidate for U.S. Senate. And by the way, she's a Democratic socialist, in my view. And she was going around saying she was an equal partner with Walz for 4 years. And so she's an equal partner with Walz, and she's sort of an equal owner of the fraud problem.
And this is obviously for the seat of retiring Minnesota Senator Tina Smith, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. I want to ask you about what is the direction and politics of Minnesota right now? Because I believe, unless I'm wrong, you were the last Republican to have held a statewide office in Minnesota. And that was when you were reelected as governor in 2006. Kamala Harris in 2024 won the state by 4 points. That was the 13th consecutive Democratic presidential win there. At the same time, Republicans are currently, albeit maybe temporarily, in charge of the state house, thanks to some vacancies, and Democrats only have a 1-seat majority in the state Senate. Have you seen any movement in the state, particularly under the years of Donald Trump, more toward conservative positions? Will this scandal make any difference to the politics of the state?
Well, it's basically a blue state, Kim, to net it out. There are pockets of republicanism in Minnesota, in congressional districts or legislative districts, and the legislature goes back and forth. It's sort of equally tied, or one side or the other is a little ahead in a given cycle. But in statewide elections, we haven't won a statewide election since I last won in 2006. Donald Trump's been on the ballot 3 times in Minnesota, so that's the purest form of MAGA, and he lost 3 times. And a couple times it wasn't close. So if you present to Minnesota just a MAGA-only candidate, that person's probably going to lose. But if the person's mega enough to satisfy and excite the mega base, and also not being so mega to scare away the independents you need to win in a blue place, it's possible, but we need 3 things. We need at least a neutral or better political macro environment. That's number 1. Number 2, we need quality candidates. And for a lot of those years I just described, we didn't have quality candidates. This year we do. And then number three, you have to have the Democrats make some unforced errors or mistakes, which they've now done through this fraud and some other things. So all of the elements of a potential Republican win are in place in 2026. The problem is with Walz bowing out, the likely person running for governor is going to be U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar, perhaps. I hope she doesn't as a Republican, and the reason I hope she doesn't is because she's extraordinarily popular and she wins all of her races by a comfortable margin, and she'd be very difficult to beat.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was looking it up. She has won all 4 of her Senate races by 16 points.
Yeah.
Now, some people talk about how she does present a little bit more of a little bit more as a moderate Democrat. The progressive base has been pretty demanding about what they want. Would she have any trouble there?
Well, I think if she were a newcomer in starting from scratch and going into the grassroots Democratic Party of today, she would probably have some trouble because their party has shifted dramatically at the grassroots level towards the Democratic Socialists. But because of her status and stature and fundraising and her, likability, setting aside her politics and the goodwill she's built up, I think she could, fairly easily get through the democratic process. But I think it would be a different story if she was sort of starting over and nobody knew who she was.
You mentioned that in times past, the GOP hasn't had the best field in terms of quality candidates. What do you think about the field shaping up for this year's run? I mean, I've seen some names. There's the Speaker of the Minnesota House, Lisa DeMuth, Mike Lindell, the chief executive of MyPillow. I mean, do you think that there's an opportunity to get someone that can really connect with Minnesota voters?
Well, we have a dozen people on the Republican side running for governor, and I won't go through them all because your show would get too boring and long. But in my view, just by way of example, I don't want to exclude anybody because they're all people I know and friends with most of them. You mentioned Lisa Dayworth.
I knew you were going to do that. I knew you were going to do that.
Well, it's too long of a list. She's Speaker of the House, and she's got a lot of skill. And, she is somebody who I think could do what I described earlier, satisfy the mega crowd, but also get some other votes you need to win in a blue state. There's another state legislator, Kristen Robbins, who's a suburban legislator, conservative, but same dynamics that I just mentioned. There's an outsider running who's had no political background, who's sort of a fire breather, Chris Madel, who's a lawyer. A lot of people think he might have some juice to get through the Republican process. But again, we're going to know a lot more about what this really looks like when Senator Klobuchar makes her decision.
Well, last question for you, which gets to the other thing. Another one of the things you said was a prerequisite to doing well in Minnesota, but you were talking about economic conditions. So we're headed into a new year here, 2026. House Republicans are trying to decide what their next bit of their agenda is going to be. I personally would love to see them making more of a kind of question of what happened in Minnesota as a way to maybe make some progress on welfare reform. But as you sit and you look, and the conversation is obviously affordability and economic circumstances, we're still dealing with this hangover from Biden inflation. What would be the 1 or 2 things you would suggest to Republicans in Washington as the first things or the most important things they could do to help the economy and help them in the midterms?
Yeah, I think if you just net it out for most people, they want to know how much does their food cost? How much does their fuel or gas cost? How much does their housing cost? How much does their healthcare cost? And they don't necessarily understand all the details and the levers and the wheels that spin to make that all work. But whatever Republicans can do to make those things more affordable, or at least not have inflation take off again, would be, I think, the most important thing. Because as you know, almost in every election, if it isn't the number one issue, it's pretty close to number one, is the pocketbook. And that's paramount.
Wise words. We want to thank you, former Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty. We also want to thank our listeners for tuning in. We are here every week. If you like the show, please do hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at atkim@wsj.com.